Next, it's being described as a discriminatory and unfair decision. Tonight, Sutton Council is dealing with anger for charging people who pay for their parking with cash around 30% more than those who pay with an app. It is so divisive, the government has even stepped in to try to get Sutton Council to change its mind on the policy over fears it discriminates against those who are older or vulnerable. Here's our political correspondent, Simon Harris.
Paying to park used to be simple. The only challenge was having the right change. But in the South London borough of Sutton, putting money in a machine now comes with a surcharge. An hour's parking in Wallington costs £2 if drivers use an app, but £3 if they pay at the machine.
I don't have a phone that has an app on it anyway.
It's unfair, but I'm desperate, so I need it. So I need to pay.
When you're old, you know, you don't know what apps are and all that.
Do you ever think about paying with cash? I used to, I don't very often now. Even my wife asked me to set it up when she goes out in the car, so now we generally use the app all the time.
Councils in London began charging for parking in 1958 when the first meters appeared.
This is primarily to relieve congestion and to share out fairly the limited curb space in central London.
65 years on, the parking meter has given way to smart parking, with most councils relying on apps like Ringo. Pay and display machines might generate income, but Sutton Council regards them as a drain on resources. Partly for security reasons, 2 people are needed to empty them, and that comes at a cost. But last year, Sutton's pay and display parking spaces raised more than £500,000.
They're making a lot of money from parking. In fact, Sutton has one of the highest parking charges, not just in London, but anywhere in the country. And that's not to add on all the extra charges from various parking zones they've introduced. So the council's making money from parking, and there's no need for them to have this disparity.
The charity Age UK claimed older drivers would be hit the hardest. And the motoring organisation, the RAC, described Sutton's policy as discriminatory. The government's asked you to reconsider, will you?
No, because what we've got to do is to be fair on Sutton's residents, and we've got to make sure that we spend Sutton's residents' money in the right way. And that is by doing things, let's say, in the modern way, in the right way. You know, more and more people don't carry cash.
The prospect of a cashless society doesn't appeal to Kevin and Patricia.
Our grandchildren, they all use the apps, don't they? They say to me, Granddad, get an Uber app. I said, what's an app? I don't, you know, that means you've got to give them your bank account, innit? Numbers. And we're very handy that because I just think that's where half the fraud comes from.
For now, Sutton will keep its pay and display machines, but at least half a dozen London boroughs have gone a step further and don't accept cash at all. Simon Harris, ITV News, Carshalton.
Good evening. The growing anger over the Mayor's plans to expand the ultra-low emission zone is familiar. Cameras have been vandalised and there have been protests in central London. But that anger has reached a new level by one man who is staging a one-week hunger strike outside Uxbridge Station. Prabdeep Singh says the scheme discriminates against those who can't afford to pay or to buy a new car. Sadiq Khan has called on Mr Singh to reflect and reconsider his protest, but remains adamant that nothing will get in the way of his plans. Our political correspondent Simon Harris has more.
It's not the obvious place to go on hunger strike, next to a baker's, but this is where Prabdeep Singh has set up his ULEZ protest camp in the middle of Uxbridge.
I got everything I need to stay overnight. That's my small bed. Got a blanket to take on.
Mr Singh, a minicab driver from Reading, says he can't afford a new car and faces a £12.50 fee every time he comes into London. So he's decided to stop eating for a week.
Why just 7 days?
7 days is enough to, leave the awareness, leave the message. It's not about starving, It's just to get the attention of the people or to indicate.
So it's a stunt?
It's a signify. It's not a stunt.
Even in the pouring rain, people were stopping to offer their support.
Good for him that he's actually doing it, but I don't think he's going to be. The Mayor of London isn't really going to batter an eyelid.
It's time somebody stood up to get on.
The Sheilas, it just doesn't make sense. It's attacking the ordinary people.
But not everyone shares Mr Singh's views.
If we don't save the climate, our children, our grandchildren...
You're wasting your time.
Yeah, no, I'm very sorry to see that sort of thing.
The planned expansion of the ultra-low emission zone at the end of the month has prompted a range of protests. There have been demonstrations like this one in Trafalgar Square and attacks on ULEZ cameras, deliberate attempts to sabotage the scheme. But this is the first hunger strike.
I'd ask the gentleman on hunger strike to reconsider. Nobody wants anybody to be on hunger strike. Nobody wants anybody to be inconvenienced by this policy, which will save lives, protect children's lungs, and also tackle the climate emergency.
Last week, the Mayor relaxed the rules to allow more Londoners to apply for a grant to scrap their car or van ahead of the ULEZ expansion. But volunteers at this food bank in Barking say that £2,000 is nowhere near enough to replace their older cars.
There are going to be people who are going to be going hungry, and it is really, a concern for us that we're having many sleepless nights of trying to work out where we're going to go to get this funding. We did try to raise some funds, but we haven't had any joy.
The Mayor's scrappage scheme is of no use to Prabdik Singh either. He lives outside London, so can't apply. Simon Harris, ITV News, Uxbridge.
Now, it started with clips on social media encouraging mass looting of shops on Oxford Street, and has seemingly ended this evening with just a handful of arrests. In between, though, the Met had to put 11 dispersal orders in place and put on a show of force to stop those who planned an afternoon of disorder. Our political correspondent Simon Harris reports now from Oxford Street.
When the Met said its response would be robust, this is what it meant. Two young men forcibly detained on Oxford Street during an operation to foil a suspected shoplifting flash mob. The police had been alerted by a social media post inviting participants to a robbery. West End stores were advised to make their security staff visible from the street, and many did. The number of police officers in the area was stepped up. As an added measure, Scotland Yard put in place a dispersal order, giving police powers to tell people to leave the area or face arrest. And the Met also posted its own video on social media.
Some people might be aware that there are plans for antisocial behaviour to happen here on Oxford Street. And what I would say to those people that are intending on doing that is that we will be here and we will not tolerate that activity here in London.
London's Mayor also urged people not to go to Oxford Street to take part in what he called this nonsense we have seen on TikTok. The focus of the police attention was a sports shop where, approaching 3 o'clock, people began to gather. No one seemed to be sure what was happening, but if something was planned, this apparently was where it would be. Hundreds of people were now lining the pavement, watching and waiting. Traffic struggled to get through the crowd, but apart from a brief flurry of activity when the two men were arrested, the threatened public disorder failed to materialise. Simon Harris, ITV News, Oxford Street. A man has escaped with his life after what was thought to be a gas explosion at a house in Battersea. Neighbours were forced to leave their homes after the roof of one property collapsed. Let's go straight to Simon Harris, who's at the scene. Simon, what happened? Carolyn, someone living here in Elsley Road in Battersea in South London can count themselves very lucky tonight. It's thought the elderly resident of a two-storey, end-of-terrace brick house was downstairs at lunchtime today when, for some reason, there was an explosion upstairs. The blast blew out the windows and sent masonry crashing into the street.
I was working at home in my bedroom, which is a couple of doors down from where the explosion was. Heard a big bang. We've been having work done on trees here, and I thought it might be one of the trees that had come down, but it was much longer, the sound, and it sort of sounded like a bomb had gone off or something. So I came downstairs to check, and everyone was out on the street looking to see what happened. And there was shrapnel, bits of broken glass, bricks had been blown out from the house. And we knew that there's an old guy that lived there, and it was unlikely that he had been away. But there was no response when people were calling. But somebody, I think from number 35, actually went in there to get him out.
The emergency services were quickly on the scene, not sure what to expect, but soon had the street cordoned off.
When the crews turned off, a few minutes later, the actual person who was inside the house was outside and made the way out and was sitting on the opposite on the wall, obviously quite shocked. He was very lucky indeed. He was actually in the ground floor when it went bang, as it were, and he was very lucky. He was quite shocked, but unfortunately other than that, he's uninjured.
The fire brigade initially treated this as a suspected gas explosion, but the gas supply was later ruled out as the possible cause. However, neighbours say there was work being carried out on the house and there may have been gas bottles upstairs, although that, of course, will be the subject of an investigation by the fire service. As for the elderly owner of the house, well, it seems that he was very badly shaken, but thankfully uninjured.
OK, Simon, thanks very much indeed.
A man has escaped with his life after what was thought to be a gas explosion at a house in Battersea. Neighbours were forced to leave their homes after the roof of one property collapsed. Our correspondent Simon Harris sent this report.
Someone living here in Elsley Road in Battersea can count themselves very lucky tonight. It seems the elderly resident of a two-storey end-of-terrace brick house was downstairs at lunchtime today when, for some reason, there was a huge explosion upstairs. The blast blew out the windows and sent brickwork and masonry crashing into the street.
We've been having work done on trees here, and I thought it might be one of the trees that had come down, but it was much longer, the sound, and it sort of sounded like a bomb had gone off or something. So I came downstairs to check, and everyone was out on the street looking to see what had happened. And there was shrapnel, bits of broken glass, bricks had been blown out from the house. And we knew that there's an old guy that lived there, and it was unlikely he had been away, but there was no response when people were calling. But somebody, I think from number 35, actually went in there to get him out.
The emergency services were quickly here, not sure what to expect.
When the crews turned off, a few minutes later, the actual person who was inside the house was outside and made the way out and was sitting on the opposite on the wall, obviously quite shocked. He was very lucky indeed. He was actually in the ground floor when it went bang, as it were, and he was very lucky. He was quite shocked, but unfortunately other than that, he's uninjured.
The fire brigade initially treated this as a suspected gas leak, but now say it was unrelated to the mains gas supply. However, neighbours say there was work being carried out on the house and there were gas cylinders upstairs. That will now be the subject of an investigation by the fire service. As for the man who lived here, by all accounts he was very badly shaken, but thankfully uninjured.